We're here today at the fabulous Canadian Northern HO scale model railroad that Tommy Hood has built. And here's the CEO, president, and jack of all trades, Tommy himself.
Hi.
How you doing there, Tom?
I'm doing very well.
This railroad's been around a while, eh?
Oh, since 1968.
Yeah, when did you actually start to look at formally operating it like a real railroad?
About 15 years ago.
Yes.
Mostly stampeded by Doug himself.
Yeah.
He sort of got us rolling, and I reluctantly was drug into the game. Been fun.
Well, hopefully they weren't illicit drugs.
Oh no.
Well, so what kind of a system is being used right now? What kind of operating system to put all your cars and everything, your locomotives in?
Train order using what system, Doug?
Rail op.
It's rail
For
op.
a freight car forwarding.
So you're using for your freight car forwarding rail up. So it's a computer-based program. It generates trains.
Yes.
And that way, I guess every session follows from the next in terms of the location of the cars.
Yes.
Well, that makes it kind of convenient.
And difficult too, because you can't basically show people how the railroad runs because you take cars out of the sequence.
Sure.
Unless you very carefully put them back.
How many people does it take to operate this railroad?
About 21.
About 21 people, and so on an evening there's quite a few trains generated, I would suggest.
Yes, we moved, what, 540 cars last time?
Well, that's quite
an evening.
And that's in a, what, a 2-hour session roughly?
About
Something
2.5
like that.
hours.
2.5 hours? Well, that's really great. Well, we're going to chat with Doug and find out a little bit more about how other people can make their railroad into an operating system so that it's more like the prototype and also get some additional enjoyment out of the hobby.
Good.
Hi, I'm Mike Hamer, and I'm here today with Doug Matheson, and we're in Tommy Hood's basement visiting his great Canadian Northern Railroad. Doug's an experienced model railroader, and he's really into train operations, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, Doug, would you like to share some thoughts you have on train operations?
Sure. We're here on the Canadian Northern. We try and operate with timetable and train order dispatching. Tom has set his railroad in 1948, and the normal scheme of dispatching in most of Canada at that time was timetable and train orders, widely used really by a lot of railroads in the United States as well, and it predates to a large extent things like centralized traffic control and stuff like that. So we use that as our method of dispatching, and we really want to talk a little bit about that today.
Excellent, Doug. So what's involved with creating train orders and following a timetable on a model railroad?
Okay, well, we try and follow the prototype practice as much as we can, but we do have to simplify it a little bit as we go along, and we'll get into that in a moment, how we simplified it. If we think a little bit about how the prototype actually operated, and we go back in time, I mean, this was around, timetable and train orders have been around for a long, long time. They really started in the 19th century, the latter part of the 19th century, and they lasted, this form of dispatching lasted for about 100 years during the time when there was no radio contact. Right. It really was the form of technology used to safely and efficiently move traffic during an era when there wasn't very good communications, and when there was a lot of traffic. The railroads operated really in a very dense sort of way on single track line, usually without a lot of signals. So, so it's a fascinating way to do business.
And you've partially answered my next question. I was going to ask, when did train orders and timetable operations cease? You've mentioned radio control already.
Yes, the timetable and train orders slowly phased out around the middle part of the 20th century, and it was replaced partly by signal systems, so we could get dispatching by the dispatcher could set the signals on the railroad, and there was various forms of that. And then in addition, the ability of the dispatcher to speak directly to a train crew. led to the elimination of train order stations, agents, and the paperwork and so on that went with it. And modern railroads operating in dark territory, unsignaled, most of the short lines fit in that category, and there's still a lot of main line that's unsignaled as well. They tend to operate with what's known as track warrants, where the dispatcher speaks directly to the train crew using a radio.
I know, Doug, you're going to show us some examples of train orders and timetables. It must be fascinating for the dispatcher. It keeps you busy in an operating session on a layout as large as Tommy's.
It does, and I've been by default, I was elected as a dispatcher here ever since we started, and it is on a busy railroad in the model form. The stations are so close together that the dispatcher is kept very, very busy with the job.
Selective compression.
It is selective compression. It's selected the wrong way as far as the
dispatcher's concerned.
Yeah.
Now, can you show us some samples of train orders and timetables?
Sure. The concept is actually very simple, Mike. Of course, the devil's in the details, as it always is. But the idea behind timetable and train orders was that there was a timetable struck by the railroad that provided a schedule for, I'm not going to say most, but say a number of their trains. And then trains would be sent out to follow this timetable as well as they could. Now, the dispatcher has the ability or the authority to modify the timetable. He can add extra trains to it, or he can change the times at which trains move, how they move over the railroad. But to modify the timetable, he has to do it in writing and issue instructions to the not just the new train, if he creates an extra train, but also to any train that might be affected out on the line. And in order to carry all this out, over time, the real railroads developed an extensive set of rules that covered every possible situation. And I think jokingly we can say that most of these rules were created after an accident, but probably not a laughing matter at the time. And I have here a little book called a Condensed Code of Operating Rules. It's from the 1951 edition. What this book is the real code was called the Unified Code. And most railroads use the Unified Code or a slight variation of it. And in this particular book, some modelers got together, took the Unified Code, and modified it ever so slightly in order to make it more adaptable to the model railroad.
So, Doug, you're saying this is a book written by model railroaders?
I would say edited by model railroaders. The real Unified Code is the basis, and this book really contains something like 700 rules by which the real railroads operated in 1951. Now, this set of rules, a timetable, and train orders were the tools by which the trains move safely and efficiently over a single track railroad or a double track railroad in any situation in the timetable and train order era. And so maybe we should look at some examples, or an example of
excellent. And just one further question before we do, Doug. We condense our layouts to 1/87th and HO scale, and I see this as a condensed code of operating rules, yet there are still 700 rules. Do you condense the condensed version down for the operators who come to visit Tommy's layout here and run the Canadian Northern?
Yes, in fact, we've gone to some lengths to simplify timetable and train orders to make it more feasible to implement it on a model railroad. What we tried to do is retain the character of it, to retain the formality of it, but at the same time eliminate some of the labor and some of the paper so that we can enjoy our modeling process. And for example, I have here a little folder. This little folder is a folder that I created as the
Chief
dispatcher.
yeah.
And what I did was I took the Condensed Code of Operating Rules, which contains, as I mentioned, something like 700 rules that cover all possible situations. And in this little pamphlet, I've laid out a number of rules, and really there's 20 rules here. And these are the sorts of things that we ask our operators to be knowledgeable of. Now, of course, we're not in a life and death situation like the real railroads are.
That's right.
We don't have rules classes, and we don't have inspectors out there that give tests and so on. But this little pamphlet gives sort of the 20 rules by which, if crews follow these rules, they can move expeditiously over the Canadian Northern, and they capture the flavor of the timetable and train order operation.
Excellent. And I'm sure the operators appreciate knowing the basic rules for the land.
Keeps the dings out of the brass too, right?
That's right.
We try.
No cornfield meats, Chris.
We try. Seriously, it is quite an effort for crews who are inexperienced in timetable and train order to learn the rules. But once they do, and they come to appreciate how a real railroad actually functioned during the era when this was in vogue, and I think they enjoy the operating sessions a lot more because of it. What it does, and we'll get into this when we start to show how this is carried out, what it does is place the onus on a crew to make decisions about moving over the railroad. The timetable sets out a schedule, but a crew still has to decide whether they can safely move their train or not. In other forms of dispatching, the dispatcher decides and basically says you can go or you can't go. In this situation, the dispatcher is just modifying the timetable, and in fact, for most trains, in most situations, the crew, looking at the timetable, looking at the train orders that they have in hand, and with the book of rules in the background,
gives you a global understanding of the situation at the time.
Right, and then from that, they make a decision whether it's safe to move their train or not.
Excellent. So, Doug, can you show us an example of a timetable?
Okay. On the Canadian Northern, we've over time developed a timetable. It's a bit of a part art and part science to get a timetable together for a model railroad. I won't go into how it was done, but we have here an example of one of the 3 timetables that we use. Now, on the Canadian Northern, instead of using a fast clock, we use the wall clock. We could use a fast clock if we wanted to, but we find it easier to, everybody has a wristwatch or whatever, we find it easier to use the wall clock. And if we look at this timetable, all timetables on the prototype were arranged in a similar fashion. In the middle is a list of the train order and other stations that trains will pass through right here. And these are usually arranged, and they are here, from east to west and west to east, depending on which side of the page you're looking at. So if we look on this side of the page, these are trains that are eastward, so the stations are listed west to east, and the other side is the reverse. So here, if you read up, you go east to west. Now, across the top of this form, we can see here the first class, second class, and third class trains are listed. On the Canadian Northern, these are the only trains that are on the timetable. Other trains would be extras and are treated as such, and therefore they don't show on the timetable. If we look at, say, a first class train right here, number 8, it's a passenger train, and you can see going down, you can see the stops that it makes and the times in the timetable for it on the wall clock. Okay. This basic timetable, we have 3 of them. Each one represents, theoretically, an 8-hour day, and this one is the morning timetable, which would be essentially the day shift.
And Doug, if I'm a visitor to the layout and I'm out crewing a train at the time, are these on the fascia boards for me to refer to, or do I carry a clipboard?
One of the rules in the rule book is that every employee is supposed to have the appropriate and up-to-date employee timetable, and so you'll be given one of these at the outset of the session to cover the time frame that we're working in.
Excellent. Well, Doug, we've dealt with the rules, we've looked at the timetable. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the tools at your disposal when you have to dispatch a railroad?
Sure. The dispatcher has to issue in writing any instructions which modify the timetable, and that to either create an extra train or to change the way that the trains that are on the line are running. And the way in which this is done is to issue what's known as a train order. And I have here an example of a train order that we use on the Canadian Northern. It's simplified a little bit from the form that the real railroads use. They had we'll talk a little bit in a moment about some of that. But in this form, you can see in this form that the dispatcher here is basically annulling a train. And what he has to do in annulling a train is, since this train is on the timetable, trains that are out on the line would be expecting this train. And since it's a second-class train, if you were a third-class train, he has superiority, and you would have to wait for him. Well, the dispatcher really has to let everybody know that this train isn't going to run today.
Your inferior train would be waiting for a long time.
That's it.
Right, yeah.
So this train order would be created to and would be issued to all the trains that might be affected by this train, and it just basically tells them that this train is annulled, and therefore they can go about their business as if this train wasn't even on the timetable on this particular day.
So, Doug, we presume that when you arrive to dispatch the layout, you don't know which train orders you'll be issuing because it all develops with the evolution of the session that evening, I would imagine.
That's right. I know in advance that certain extras will run.
Okay.
But beyond that, I don't really know. So if a train, there's always surprises in the session, just like on the real railroad. And when a train is running, if it gets to be late, or if some other event happens, perhaps during the session we discover that we have to actually move some cars that we hadn't anticipated. We have to call another extra and so on. There's always surprises, and there's always things for the dispatcher to consider.
Big treat. For our session today, Chris, we've created 3 distinct scenarios where the dispatcher must write train orders, and they're 3 different unique situations, and Doug will talk to that.
Okay, I have a couple of train orders to show you that we created for today's session, and the first one is what we would call a running order for an extra. And in this particular train order, the dispatcher creates an extra, and we use, on the Canadian Northern, we use the approach that if an extra is created and there's another extra already created, in order to avoid a lap, the train order that creates the second extra should specify the meeting point with the train that's already on the line. So this train order, in fact, does that, and it creates an extra, which we're going to call extra 3600 West. 3600 will be the number of our locomotive that we use in the extra, and that's a train that we'll use in our little demonstration today.
So, Doug, just one question I have. One train order can annul an earlier train order, of course.
Yes, if the dispatcher wanted to, for example, in this particular train order, the dispatcher created an extra and specified that this extra 3600 West, was to meet an extra that was already on the line, and gave the location. So one of the things that he could do is he could annul the whole order, in other words, annul the extra, and he would issue a subsequent order which annulled this train order as if it didn't exist. Another thing that he could do is he could leave this train order as is, but change the meeting point with the extra that's out there. As the session developed, if this train was, say, late, or got to be later than the dispatcher expected, he could issue a new train order, which essentially changed the meeting point of this train with the train that's already out on the line.
So as dispatcher, you need a sharp pencil, I'm sure, Doug.
You have to keep your wits about you. There isn't much time to really sit and think, but at the same time, it should be measured and shouldn't. My approach when I'm dispatching is to try and let the timetable do as much of the work as I can.
Excellent.
And I don't take the view that I can write train orders and rearrange a timetable better than it's already done.
Right. Can you show us the third example?
Okay.
Then?
In the third example. Again, the dispatcher created another extra, and not the train that we'll be concerned with, but this train is going to pass us at a certain point, and what the dispatcher has done in this train order is create a new extra, and has told us that we can expect this train at a certain time, approximately, and also this order created a meeting point for the new train with the other extra that's on the line that we also have to meet.
Excellent.
And as our demonstration evolves a bit, we'll see how these train orders come into play and how we use them.
You've given us a lot of information, Doug. I'm still interested in knowing how you would simplify this for the model railroader.
Okay, in order to simplify it, you keep in mind that in the real world, when timetable and train orders were introduced, especially the train order portion, the dispatcher would write the train order in a big book. He would dictate it to a station agent. The agent would take the train order and write it out or type it out. He would then read it back for clarity and to make sure that it was proper, and this would be repeated for everybody who was involved in the train order. So it's a very laborious process.
But safety is number one, of course.
Safety is number one, and it was only after all these steps had been taken that the dispatcher would complete the train order and put it into effect. And so on the Canadian Northern, we don't have real station agents. We don't have enough manpower for that.
Exactly.
So we've taken some steps to simplify this, but still retain the character of the operation. And the way that we've done this is as follows. We've created a timetable. We showed an example of that timetable, and I simplified the book of rules down to that little pamphlet. So we have the little pamphlet. We use the wall clock as our timekeeping mechanism, and then when it comes to the actual dispatching, the dispatcher will write on the Canadian Northern, writes the train order. We do it in writing, and in order to communicate with the train crew, since we don't have station agents, we've used a system that allows the dispatcher from a computer on the dispatcher's desk to set a train order semaphore at each station. And so when the semaphore is set to red, the train crew knows that there's a train order. We don't really distinguish between the Form 19 and Form 31. Those are terms on the real railroad about train orders which could be picked up on the fly. You've all seen pictures of people hooping up train orders, or whether the train had to actually stop and sign for the train order. In our case, we set the signal to red. The crew has to come to the dispatcher's desk and pick up the train order themselves. The last portion that we've simplified has to do with what's known as a clearance card. On the real railroad, a train, say you had a train that was actually on the timetable, not an extra, and so you don't need a train order or anything else to run.
You just run the schedule.
You just have to run the schedule. But before you can depart from the initial station, the dispatcher and everybody else needs to know that you're kind of out there on the road.
That's right.
And so in order for a train to depart its initial station, needs a clearance card on the real railroad. And the clearance card, all it is essentially the authority from the dispatcher for this particular train to run a schedule or to run as an extra, and the clearance card will list the train orders that the train is supposed to have, and for safety, for safety's sake, you know, then the conductor and the engineer would know exactly what train orders to look for. We've simplified that, and we use a verbal clearance here. That the train crew is still to report to the dispatcher and get a verbal clearance that he has noted them on his train sheet and that they're ready to go, but we don't actually issue the clearance card. And similarly at other stations, we don't issue the clearance card as well. It's a verbal clearance.
Excellent. And from the dispatcher's desk, you have a control panel where you change the aspect at each station?
For the train order signals, we have that. We use a system. We use the JMRI software that allows us to set the signal aspect on the train order signals.
Excellent.